Hi there, welcome back to the Dan Cave and welcome back to another video build, and in today's video I'll be building the Academy 1/72 scale Super Etendard. So this is a fairly simple kit from Academy. It's got a good set of character decals in it, which is probably the highest point of the kit. The kit itself is fairly simple, relatively old moulding, but easy enough to put together, so decided to do it in one video this time. I've put myself back up in the corner again because, once again, who wants to see a kind of full-size picture of this mug? Certainly if you're on a big screen TV you probably don't, so somewhere down below, somewhere, you'll see me starting to unbox the kit. So I'm not going to hang around too long. I'll just say one thing. So thank you to everyone who's liked and subscribed videos so far. If you've not done so, please give a subscribe. If you like the video, give a like. If you want to leave a comment, please do. Comments can be whatever you want, questions, you name it. I'll try and answer all of them. So thank you to everyone who's watched, and thank you for watching this video. I'll come back a little bit later on once we've gone through all the build and talk about what I think of the Academy kit that I've built today. So sit back, put your feet up, have a coffee, have a beer, whatever you want, and enjoy the video. I'll catch everybody later on. So thanks for watching. Okay, so wow, that hairy bloke went on quite a bit, so we've actually missed the start of the build sequence. So you've not missed that much. I suppose it's the big failing of this kit for me is the cockpit. There is a seat, there is a cockpit tub with some side consoles, control stick, and a panel. But they're basically flat pieces. There's no detail whatsoever. There's not even a decal, which, considering Academy went to the trouble of producing some cartograph decals for this reboxing, it's a little bit disappointing that they didn't go so far as to put in a decal for the instrument panel. So ultimately, the few little bits that are there, seat's been painted in olive drab, just to represent those seat cushions. So very simple part, and went straight into the fuselage, and here I am just gluing those two fuselage halves together using Tamiya Extra Thin. So the wings come two separate pieces, upper and lower sections. A little bit of cleanup, and I'm going to use some old school tube glue. I've got it, so I'm going to use it. So it does come in handy for where you've got kind of connection pins on the inside of the wing like this, because it does have a better working time, and that'll form the basis for gluing them together. And then I'm going to use some extra thin just to run around the perimeter of that joint, and that'll help get that nicely sealed up without kind of glue kind of squeezing out through the joint, which is the one downside of using tube glue, or the risk you have. So just using a standard close peg to clip them together. So the belly section is separate on this kit, so I'm just removing from the sprue. There is a little bit of cleanup just to try and square off that forward end, and that sits nicely into its slot. The fit is generally quite good around the sides, but there is a bit of a step at the forward end, and that'll get filled in later on. But once again, I'm using Tamiya Extra Thin just to run it into the join line, and that'll make a nice good join. So when all that's dry, it's time to hit all those seam lines with some Ultimate Modeling Products thinny sticks, and then I'm using a little bit of sandpaper just to clean up around kind of aerials and any bumps on the rear spine. So as said, there is a little bit of filling needed around the forward fuselage join with the belly. For the engine intakes, there is a injector pin mark in the engine intakes. So I'm just using a cheap rotary tool got from Amazon to clean up those injector pin marks. So once that filler is dry, I can go back and hit it with the thinny stick, work our way up through the grades, and then finally work up to the buffer. So plenty of dust removed. I'm just going to use a donated makeup brush, donated by my wife. So in the nose wheel gear bay, it's quite hard to get a sanding stick in there, so I'm just kind of scraping away the excess. It'll limit the amount of sanding I need to do in the awkward spots. But again, that just hides that horribly visible seam line through the nose gear bay. So now it's on to the intake. So to stop any paint getting in the cockpit, I'm just going to mask over the cockpit area, and that'll give me kind of free rein to get some white paint on the intakes. I'm not sure exactly what the color should be. I kind of chose white because a lot of them are white. So I'm using Vallejo Model Air matte white. Just going to work that round both sides of the intake. And then that's also sprayed on the parts where we removed the injector pins earlier. So the intake parts slot in quite nicely. I've not cleaned up the paint along the edges. It's acrylic paint. It's fairly recently dried. The Tamiya Extra Thin will just go straight through that. And there'll be no issues with gluing those parts in this case. If it were a more structural component, you should really clean off any paint off the edges to get a better, kind of stronger joint. But in this case, it's not proved to be an issue in these kind of additional parts on the outside, like intakes like that. So now I can get to gluing the wings on. So I'm using a couple of pound coins just sat under the wing, which just props them up a little bit, just enough to get the alignment kind of where I want it. I'm using an image off the internet of the 3 view of the aircraft, which gives me a good idea of how the alignment should look. In 70-second scale, you can kind of get away with eyeballing the alignment. It depends on the kit, depends on how it's put together, but in this case, the eyeballing method seemed to work just fine. Same for the horizontal tail planes, a little bit of Tamiya Extra Thin, and they're aligned nicely using Mark 1 eyeball. So I'm pretty happy with how that looks. I've got pretty much all the major components now together. And it's time to go around and check all those recently installed parts for seam lines. So the wing roots do need a little bit of filler, not a huge amount. So I'm just using a little bit of Revell's model filler. Just press it into that joint, and I'll come back later with a variety of sanding sticks and thinny sticks from UMP to get into those little awkward areas. Again, minimal amount of filler used. You don't want it to spread everywhere, just in the areas where you really need it. So luckily enough on this kit, it is recessed panel detail, so most of the areas that are being filled, it'll be easy enough to restore any detail lost by the filling process. But I suppose for such a simple kit, it is a little bit disappointing that pretty much every kind of part, except for the main kind of fuselage halves, needed a little bit of filler. But once that's done and set to dry, we can start the priming process. So the kind of weapons and fuel tank have been assembled off camera. Similar process. I'm using UMP grey primer. For something like this, it's pretty much going down in one coat. I tend to work my way around the model in a couple of steps. Kind of lightly misting it on. By the time I get kind of one coat finished, you can almost go back to the start. It's already touch dry. So generally just making quite light passes on each area. Just making sure that grey builds up. Not too wet, not to the point where it'll run. And of course that does help unify all the colours on the surface where you've got fillers, etc. Helps you visualise where any seam lines have been corrected, whether there's any ghost seams appearing. But I think in this case I'm pretty happy with the result. Certainly good enough for what I wanted to do. So after that, primer's had probably about an hour to dry, and gone back in with some Vallejo Model Air Black just to pre-shade some of the panel lines, because the underside colours is kind of medium to light grey, with then a slightly darker grey for the camouflage pattern. But again, that kind of pre-shading will show through. So I'm not doing very detailed or very specific lines, quite broad, but again it just adds to that kind of tonal variation will come through in the subsequent coats. So that pre-shading is carried on the underside and all the way around to the top side. I mean, generally it's following the panel lines that are there, and control surfaces. And yeah, it's a nice little way to add a little bit of kind of depth to the colour. So on the underside, so I'm using an ammo acrylic paint. So it's come from their French Modern Jets set. I think the number is FS36293. So that's MiG 236. So to start with, I'm putting this lighter grey colour on the underside. This does cover top and bottom, and then it's kind of a dark grey camouflage over the top. But I'm going to start with the bottom because that's all one colour. So I'm just beginning to lightly build up some layers of paint. Certainly with the ammo paints, they do recommend that the very first coat is certainly a very light dust coat. That helps, I guess, give a good kind of paint surface for adherence, and then you can go back over it once that's flashed off. But certainly that kind of approach suits the kind of style of painting I do anyway, where I do tend to do lighter, kind of multiple passes as one coat. So we just work our way around the underside a couple of times. Kind of almost like a pick kind of line across along the fuselage to kind of stop for the underside. Basically it's looking for anything that'll be difficult to paint once the model is flipped around the other side. So generally trying to get the underside of the wings, that side of the fuselage, underside of the tail planes. So all in all, these particular paints have worked very well. So that's left to dry for probably less than an hour. And then I'm going to come back. And on the underside, I used the UMP Apex airbrush. But then for the top side, I decided I'm actually going to freehand the camo. So I decided to use, to go back to the, I think it's the 0.15 needle in the H&S Infinity. So it's a very small needle, very good for doing kind of detailed work, and pretty good for doing freehand camo. One downside is because it's acrylic, you do need to constantly check for tip dry. You can kind of see it in the way the paint is coming out. You can kind of know by the feel that, you know, if you're having to start pulling the trigger back a little bit more than you need to, it's probably because there's some paint after drying on the tip. So as long as you're conscious of that and have, you know, basically a wetted paintbrush with some thinners on it nearby, that's easy to work with. As I've just done now, I think I've just cleaned off the tip. Yeah. So next to me, out of shot, is the plan form view from the instruction sheet, which will give me the kind of broad guide for the lighter colour. There'll be a little bit of overlap. But again, the process is to try not to obliterate all that kind of pre-shading, but then also get all that light grey down in and around the areas that the colour call-outs tell you to. So it can be very enjoyable, very therapeutic process to do a freehand camo. It can also be quite frustrating at times, sometimes with acrylics, but certainly it is, when it's working, it can be a very enjoyable therapeutic process. So basically the wings are now pretty much done. Once again, I'm just clearing a little bit of tip dry. Just checking for what progress is done, constantly referring back to the diagram, try and get that camo as close to the representation in the kit instructions. For me, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, and using an airbrush in 70-second scale with a freehand, yes, the soft edge is probably way out of scale, but the finish I get with the freehand, I quite like the look of it. It's got quite a natural kind of soft edge to it, so I quite like doing it. Some people like to try and use a mask to generate that soft edge by having maybe a raised edge on the mask. I have done similar techniques, but it's quite nice to do it just pure freehand. So as with applying the colour to the bottom, it's the same process. I'm just gradually building up that kind of layer of paint, starting off with a light dusting, just build up that colour density, get it how I look without kind of completely obliterating the little bit of pre-shading that was added. I do find, certainly in dealing with these kind of greys, certainly grey on grey primer, it can be hard on the eyes because the contrast isn't necessarily there, particularly the UMP grey primer compared to these greys that I'm using. I think if I was to do it again, I'd probably go with either a black primer or a white primer, just so it's easier to see exactly where that camouflage pattern is going, just to get that kind of contrast, particularly for that initial kind of dust line around the kind of camo edge that you want to get that definition. I think you need the contrast, but overall I'm pretty happy, and this is just the outline. The refinement of that edge will come in when I do the next grey colour, or at least that's what I thought anyway. I found with the darker grey, which is FS36152, which is MiG 235, I did find that grey was incredibly close to the primer grey that I used. So actually in some ways it was quite a challenge to see exactly where you laid down the paint, but you can use the light to your advantage in that case. So use the lights in your airbrush booth, kind of angle kind of where you're looking in the right way. You can kind of see where that kind of wet layer of paint has gone down, and as you kind of build up the layers gradually, it becomes much more obvious where that paint has gone down, and you can see that kind of contrast between the two camouflage greys. Admittedly in certain lights the difference in the two greys is not a huge amount, but under a good bright light you can clearly see the demarcation. So as with the lighter grey, it's exactly the same process, just that kind of light building up of it, light dusting initially, give it a couple of seconds to flash off, then go back over it, but then kind of making sure you work to the plan form and the diagrams and the kit instructions, or whatever reference source you're using. So because of the grey colour, I did notice, certainly viewing the footage, that I was getting closer and closer to the kit, which meant it was going slightly out of shot. Hence at the moment the airbrush and the kit are getting closer and closer to the bottom of the screen. I think that's as my head went closer, I started bringing the model closer to me just so I could see a little bit better, because it is quite it's quite a similar grey to the UMP grey primer. But overall, the MiG paints perform well. I know a lot of people do complain about them and don't get on with them. for me they work fine. I have had some issues in the past. I do have some issues with some of their colours, but for this, looking at reference pics, these greys seemed close enough for me. Certainly good enough for what I wanted to get out of this model. So I'm just going back over a few areas just to make sure I've covered it as well as I want. I have tried to leave a little bit of a marbling subtle variation in the greys. It is hard to pick up on camera. It looks a little bit more obvious to the naked eye, but there is a little bit of color variation there, which seemed to kind of match with what I could see from reference pics. So once those greys had a little bit of a chance to dry, it was time to go back and paint the undercarriage bays. So I could have masked these off and I could have airbrushed them, but I thought, there's a little bit of detail in there. They're not big flat areas where I'd be worried about brush strokes. So just get in there with a detail brush and fill in all those areas. I think I've used Revell Aqua Aluminium, number 99, I think it is. Yeah, 99 aluminium. So that's used on the main undercarriage bays, the air brake bays, and the nose gear bay. So there's still a few steps in terms of detail painting on the kit. So that the nose section is painted black. The radar in there, which are normally painted black on these aircraft. So just using a little bit of masking tape, trying to make sure that there is a panel line there, trying to make sure the masking tape just follows that panel line perfectly around. And then I'll use some pieces of bigger masking tape just to block off the rest of the airframe so I don't get any overspray. So I'm also starting the masking process now on the canopies. So a lot of people use canopy masks. I tend not to. I quite enjoy this step. There's a number of ways to do it. In this case, I'm using kind of small, thin strips of Tamiya tape, using a very sharp scalpel blade just to trim off the ends, using basically the frame guide on the canopy to trim those off. And then if there's any bits in the middle, I'll just infill them with some small pieces cut from a piece of Tamiya tape. Can be time consuming on some kits. There are different ways to approach it. Sometimes you can just put a single piece on and just use the framing as a guide for a sharp knife. In this case, I've gone with using some small strips. And then for the main part of the canopy, I'm just using some washi tape that I have, which is something I got from eBay, which does seem to perform quite well, actually. Not quite as good as Tamiya tape, but does the job. So now, a little bit of airbrushing of Vallejo Model Air Black, just to do the radome section on the nose. As you can see, I've added some bigger pieces of tape just to block off any risk of overspray. As long as you keep it angled right, there should be no risk of getting black paint anywhere else. So once that's done and the nose has been unmasked, I just need to touch up a few areas around the cockpit area, just fill in that final black color for the top of the cockpit section. So just using some Revell Aqua Matte Black and a fine detail brush just to do that little bit of work. So now that that's all done, that's pretty much the airframe complete. So that's the painting complete, and certainly any detail. I've attached the canopy using some micro crystal clear, and it's time to get on to doing some decaling. So it is quite a nice sheet, printed by Cartograph. Not a huge amount of stencils. There's quite a few, and it's not the most extravagant kind of decal scheme you'll see for an aircraft, but Cartograph decals generally perform very well. So just off screen, I've got a little tub of water on a coffee warmer, and the decals will be dropped in there for about 10 or 15 seconds, and that should release them from the backing paper. So the decaling process is fairly standard. I'm using microset, basically just to wash the surface, just to have something kind of wet for the decal to go on to. It's basically a mild vinegar solution. So it will be slightly acidic, so I guess it's got some kind of degreasing, cleaning purposes, which should help the decal soften a little bit and adhere to the surface. But I've also got some UMP decal setting solution, so normal, and I think I've used some of the strong as well on some of the decals. But it's a standard process, get them to release from the backing paper. Rather than slide them off the backing paper into place, I do like to try and pick them up and just drop them in. So then I'm just using standard cotton bud just to squeeze out any excess moisture from under the decal. And then I'm going to go back in with some UMP normal, just to go over the top of the decal, which should help it soften a little bit further and sit down into any panel lines if any of those decals cross panel line. And also for the warning markings on the flaps, the clear part of the decal does go over the kind of trailing edge a little bit. So the decal solution does help soften that and conform to that trailing edge section. So that approach is done for all the decals. So the same process all the way through. So once the decals are done, I can start doing some of the detail painting on the landing gear. So off screen, they've been sprayed, airbrushed with Revell Aqua Aluminium. And now I'm going back in to do some of the detail painting. So the nose wheel gets a little detail painting, as does the exhaust with some burnt iron just on the very tip of the exhaust. And now I'm using some yellow basically to highlight some of the hydraulic piping detail that's in the undercarriage bays. So I'm just using a fine brush just to cover over the top of where that detail sits. Adds a little bit of contrast, adds a little bit of interest to the landing gear bay. So once that is all done, decals are on, it's time to get a clear coat down. And that'll form the basis for using some enamel washes. So I'm using Aqua Gloss. So you want that to go on basically a medium wet coat. You don't want it too heavy. Medium wet coat will give a reasonably glossy surface. One coat is probably good enough for doing enamel washes. And I think that'll be left to sit for about 3 hours. And then I'll go back to do some of the washes. So as you can see, I'm kind of working my way around, pretty much painted the top and bottom. Using a pair of gloves, it's kind of touch dry very, very quickly, so I've taken the risk to kind of pick it using the wingtips like that. And then I've got basically a mount that I can clip to the underside, which will allow that to dry. As you can see, that's produced a reasonably glossy surface, certainly good enough to do any kind of washing on. And that's where we go for the next step. So I'm using Humbrol's Blue Grey, which I'm just mixing on a little palette with a little bit of odorless thinners. I think it's Sandstore I'm using. So that just thins it a little bit further, helps it run a little bit easier into the panel lines. Because they're not brilliantly defined, but there are some there. So normally what I do is start section by section. Just start picking out those kind of details you want. Load up a long, thin liner brush. So you'll pick up quite a lot of material on that, and that'll allow it, quite a bit to flow off the brush when you touch it to the surface. So just trying to encourage that wash into all the kind of panel lines and any recesses. So it's quite dark, it's quite a contrast, but the next step of the process will kind of tone that back a little bit. Because as I've said in some other videos, with 70-second scale, you do need to be cautious with panel lining. Personally, I think it's very easy to go too far. I mean, if you look at pictures of aircraft, it is really about kind of looking at that subject matter to see how do the panel lines look from a photographic distance. Sometimes they can be quite, they can be quite obvious in photos, and sometimes they're not. And that's normally the kind of reference that guides me as to what I'm trying to produce at the end result. So looking at pictures of this aircraft, there are some panel lines that are obvious. They're not hugely contrasting to the grey colours. So I've gone with a blue-grey wash. When I go back with the next step, which we're just getting to, which I'm going to use a slightly different brush. And the next brush I'm going to use, I'm just using some odorless thinners, just dropped into another palette. And I'm going to use that just to reactivate that wash, move it around a little bit, and also kind of start mopping up some of the excess that I don't want. So in some ways it can seem a little bit kind of counterintuitive with a panel wash that you put lots on and then you take almost all of it back off again. But then sometimes to get the subtle effect that I'm looking for, you kind of need to kind of go beyond where you want to be to then kind of bring it back and kind of move that wash around. You can also use some of the excess that's there just to kind of add almost like a tonal streaking effect. And that kind of adds to that kind of color variation that you get. So once I'm happy with one section, I'll then move on to another section. Just progressing around, cleaning up anywhere I've put down the panel line. Just kind of move it around a little bit. As you can see, ultimately, by the time it gets to kind of close to the end of the panel lines, it is a very faint grey line that's visible, and that's pretty much exactly the effect I was looking for. So once I'm happy with that upper fuselage, I can then move on to the wings. Exactly the same process, just letting the wash kind of flow into all those kind of recessed panel lines. As much as possible, allowing that capillary reaction just to kind of work. So you almost just kind of touch it where you need it, and the recesses will just pull the wash off the paintbrush. Of course, not forgetting any kind of other parts which have got panel lines is always worth going in just to add a little bit of a panel line for contrast. In this case, it's the Exocet missile. Just gets a little bit of a wash detail added. So that's sat for a few minutes. On the wings, rather than remove a lot, I'm actually trying to kind of use what's there to kind of give more of a streaking effect. Kind of adds to the overall kind of grimy look. Going back in with a cotton bud that's been soaked in odorless thinners as well. Of course, the one benefit of using kind of washes like this is, they're not touching that aqua gloss underneath. They're not doing any damage to it. Certainly with the odorless thinners, it's a lot less potent than maybe using kind of white spirits. And of course, it means if you take too much off, that's fine. You can go back in and do it again. And of course, gives you the advantage that you can play around with the look you want. You can see how it looks with kind of a heavy effect. If you don't like it, remove some, lighten it up a little bit. If you remove too much, you can always add more back in. And then for the landing gear base, I'm going to use Ammo's Starship Wash. Again, to produce quite a kind of dirty, grimy effect, likely to be seen in an undercarriage bay. That's pretty much all the enamel washing done. So now that I'm happy with that, I've sealed all that in using Vallejo satin varnish. That's been left for an hour or two to dry a little bit, and now I'm going back in to use Ammo's shaders just to add some kind of color variation. So I'm using, I think it's navy grey, light grey, I think along the kind of upper part of the fuselage, just to give a little bit of a contrasting effect. It's incredibly subtle and so hard to see on camera. When I was doing it, you could kind of see where it was going down, but in the kind of camera view, the video footage, it's very, very subtle. So now I'm using a navy grey, which is slightly darker grey. So I'm using that to add some kind of colour filtering variation to some of the darker grey sections, and just picking out areas that I think need a little bit of colour variation, just to add to the overall effect of a kind of well-used naval aircraft. So that grey, that navy grey, is then used on the underside, mainly used around the kind of, we'll say, the movable surfaces, in and around kind of landing gear areas, and a few kind of other relatively random spots, but just add kind of colour variation in and around the arrestor hook, also adding some slightly darker grey tones. And then the final one I'm going to use is, I think it's called Grime, which is another ammo shader. And that's just going to add some kind of more grime effects towards the aft fuselage, in and around where the engine is. Again, areas that may be exposed to more kind of exhausts, oils, fuels, etc. And also anything kind of chucked back from the landing gear area. So I'm going to add some of that to the underside. So again, these are relatively subtle effects. As far as I know, they're essentially a very translucent ink. They are water based. Apparently they will clean up very easily with water. But again, the way to use them is to basically airbrush them on very light coats. Just basically a couple of passes just to build up that little bit of an effect. So as you can see on the underside, I've added a little bit more grime. So obviously that gets exposed to quite a bit more dirt from landing on aircraft carriers, etc., from wheels, engines. So yeah, so overall I'm pretty happy with how those kind of ammo shader effects have come out. I think it's added some interesting variations, a little bit of a different approach to what I've done previously with the Tomcat I did, which I spoke about in the last kind of bench review. So for the undercarriage doors, I'm just using a little bit of UMP dark dirt water-based wash, just to add a few little kind of streaks and dots of dirt. It's one of the things I've noticed I've done in the past where I've forgotten to weather things like landing gear doors. So you kind of get this nicely weathered underside and then perfectly clean doors. Sometimes it stand out quite a lot. So now that I'm happy with all that, I'm going to seal all that in with Vallejo matte varnish. So a quick kind of couple of coats of that. So that kind of tones everything back down, gives quite a good matte finish. So that's their polyurethane matte varnish, which I've mixed 50-50 with UMP thinner. Airbrush is absolutely perfect, about 20 psi. So that's left to dry for a bit, and the next step is to come back and remove the remaining bit of masking, which is over the canopy section. So just carefully peel all that off. Luckily enough, no kind of bleed through or anything like that. The colour on the canopy framing looks a good match for the rest of the airframe, because on this occasion I actually painted them separately. And now I can get on with kind of adding a little bit of dirt to the undercarriage. So I think again I'm using Starship Filth just to make sure the colours tie in with what I've used in the landing gear base. So run that in around the recesses and in the wheels and main landing gear, nose landing gear. So they're left to dry for about 45 minutes, and then they're pretty much can be handled from then on. So it's time to start that final assembly using some CA glue to put on the landing gear. So this is one of these steps where it is very easy to start rushing at this stage because you kind of feel you're near completion. But it's worth to try and restrain yourself a little bit. Certainly for me personally, this is a part of the build where I have made mistakes in the past because I've been rushing, whether that's a super glue fingerprint or getting some CA glue on a canopy, all very frustrating and all easily avoidable with just a little bit of patience and care. So all the landing gear doors, they're all done. They've had a little bit of weathering just to make sure that the colours tie in a little bit better than maybe I've done on previous builds. So I'm quite happy with how they look. They're a little bit kind of grimy and dirty, similar to the underside of the aircraft. So now I'm just adding the air brakes. So again, there's little actuators that sit behind them. A huge amount of detail on them, but enough just to give that kind of representation in 70-second scale. Which again, considering Academy have gone to the level of having a little bit of detail on the main landing gear bay, having no detail on the nose gear bay and no detail on the cockpit. So there are some contrasting aspects of this kit which are a little bit frustrating. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the outcome. So the very final step, I'm just adding a little bit of detail painting for the wingtip lights. So I'm giving it a coat of silver paint first using Revell Aqua, and then I'll go back and use some Tamiya clear colors. So while the silver is drying, looking at reference pictures and some reference shots, there's a couple of little aerials which are a yellow color. So I'm just going in with a little detail brush just to add that detail to an antenna on the top and just under the nose. While I'm doing that, that Revell Aqua Silver will have dried, and I'm going to go back and use the Tamiya Clear Red and Clear Green just to pick out those formation lights on the wingtips. So this is the very last step. Once this is done, the model is complete. So once this is done, let's cue the music and a few pictures of the kit, and then we'll come back to me for a bit of a wrap up as to what I think about it. So then, back to me. So that's it. That's the Academy Super Etendard completed. Managed to do it in one video, which is good. So the kit itself is fairly simple. It's got its flaws. The cockpit is lacking a certain amount of detail that could easily have been added with just a couple of decals. Would have made it a whole lot better. It's showing its age. There is a few areas that need a bit of filler. The kind of elements of contrast in there. I mean, you take something like the landing gear bay, which is a nice amount of detail for 70-second scale. Each kind of main leg is made up of two parts and a separate wheel, so you get that kind of level of detail in 70-second scale. But the flip side is you get a nose gear bay that's completely devoid of any detail or any depth even. Cockpit with basically nothing in it. So, but when it comes to it, it went together okay. Bit of filler, bit of sanding. The paints went on well. The colours from ammo in this case were seemed to be spot on compared to references. So one of those kits you can ask yourself, would you build it again? I doubt it. It's not kind of up there, but it is another kind of naval aircraft in the completed pile, and I am kind of fond of any aircraft that can take off of a runway that's that short, really. So I always kind of quite like naval aircraft, so one of those ones you kind of have to build at some point. So that's it. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching the video. Hope you've not fallen asleep too many times through the build. If you've not done so already, please give a subscribe, please give a like, leave a comment if you want, you know, whatever it is, I'll answer it, preferably modelling related. Anything else, you never know, I may answer them. So thanks to everyone for watching, and we'll see you again soon with, I think, part 2 of the Bristol Blenheim should be coming up next on the channel. So stay tuned and catch you all later. Thanks very much. Bye bye.